A strong man who's stronger than ever? Or is this the point where Xi Jinping goes too far? A third term for China's president sure to be rubber stamped at a 20th Communist Party Congress that's to further cement his stature as the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zetoung. We'll ask how Xi got here and whether he's overextending. Yes, China's still on course to someday overtake the United States as the world's most powerful nation, but an inevitable slowdown of its economy is now upon us, compounded by nearly 3 years and counting of a zero COVID policy that we thought would be eased soon. Will it? What are the consequences of a China that's more insular at home and more assertive on the world stage? Beyond the standoffs over Taiwan and Hong Kong, there's the growing unease of doing business with a country that uses forced labor in Xinjiang factories, a China to which the West finds itself beholden in strategic sectors. How will relations with its trading partners in Europe, Asia, and Africa evolve? And then there's Xi himself, who's proved popular at home throughout his first 10 years in power. But despite strict control and information, can one single man and his 7-member Politburo rule solo in a nation of 1.4 billion? If so, how? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if Xi is unstoppable. With us, Anne-Marie Brady, professor of Chinese politics at the University of Canterbury. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to military security analyst Zhaoan Shen for burning the midnight oil and joining us from Singapore. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Jean-Louis Rocat, professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. You're the co-author of Class and the Chinese Communist Party, 100 Years of Social Change. Welcome to the show. And we welcome back André Lezekug-Petry, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, François.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Xi Jinping calls it a mission that's, quote, glorious beyond compare. In his nearly 2-hour speech in Beijing at the outset of the party Congress, the Chinese president spelling out the course that's to be approved ahead of his anointment next Saturday for a third term. Karis Garland has more.
With the sound of trumpets and rapturous applause, Chinese President Xi Jinping is welcomed into the Great Hall of the People at Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Taking to the stage to deliver a lengthy report outlining policy priorities, Xi said the Congress came at a critical moment.
The whole party and the people of all ethnic groups are embarking on a new journey of comprehensively building a modernized socialist country.
At the end of the week-long meeting, the thousands of delegates in attendance are expected to extend Xi's rule as Communist Party chief. It would make him the first to serve a third term since founder of Communist China, Mao Zetoung. Xi congratulated the party on action from its harsh zero-COVID rule to Hong Kong's, quote, transition from chaos to governance. However, the 69-year-old said Taiwan was a matter to be resolved.
We will adhere to striving for the prospect of a peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and greatest efforts, but will never commit to abandoning the use of force.
During his decade in power, Xi has set China on an increasingly authoritarian path, tightening controls on information and dissent. But he's also expanded the country's global influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. Over the next 5 years, analysts expect little change in Beijing's policies.
Anne-Marie Brady, are there surprises at a Chinese Communist Party Congress?
Yes, that's a great question. There may be some surprises in the standing committee of the Politburo, so the core leadership team.
Because there's two levels of the inner core, right? There's a 7-member Politburo, and then there's a wider.
Yeah, 200 or so. Yeah, so there may be some surprises next weekend where we'll see who's in the inner leadership core, and we'll see the extent to which Xi Jinping has succeeded in concentrating his power.
Isn't that already done?
Oh, it is concentrated, but there are groups within the party, factions might be stretching it too far, who have different views and different interests from Xi Jinping, and he's created his own grouping. So he has still had to negotiate in the lead up to this Congress, and we will see, when we see who's on the Standing Committee, the Politburo, the extent to which he's had his way.
Can you break it down for us, Jean-Louis Roca? What are the different factions? What do they stand for?
In fact, yeah, that's true that for many people, now Xi Jinping is a sort of omnipotent person who is capable to decide for everything. In fact, it's more complex for that. We have different factions at the leadership level, of course. We have also the power and the different kind of local governments with their own interests. We have also the social strata as well. And you have the bureaucracy, and many bureaucracy have very different interests. For example, people dealing with business or economy have a certain kind of ideas, but people in charge, for example, of social security or eradication of poverty in China have different views of that. And to a certain extent, the report is a sort of summary of the I would say, of a sort of consensus, and that, the capacity probably of Xi Jinping to reach this consensus that makes him a very powerful people. But
so just to put the question simply, is there any dissent within the ranks when you look at the party members that are at this Congress?
Of course, they have a lot of dissent in terms of because you can imagine that such a big country, you have very different kind of interests in terms of geography, for example.
But in the Great Hall of the People?
And the Great Wall as well. You have faction with people having different kind of ideas and so. Of course, which is very striking now in China since 2012, that a sort of decision that China needs a strong man. That's a sort of symbol of the unity of the country. And for many people, at the leadership level, it is very important to have this kind of strong man, because precisely we have to show that we are strong in China, we're able to defend our interests, etc., etc. Of course, this man has power and can decide, but he has to take as well, the advice and to a certain extent the acceptation by many sort of people at the top about a lot of policies.
So Zhao and Shen, they're part of the people that are being replaced is because it's mandatory retirement age, 68, I believe. That's not the case, though, for the president himself. The rules were changed. He's 69, and in theory, he's on course for at least another decade. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I think it's safe to say that President Xi Jinping is positioning himself as the 21st Mao Zetoung. Now, I say that because under Xi Jinping, we've seen a transition from China's collective security to a one-man rule, which was not seen since the Cultural Revolution. And so what we're seeing right now is President Xi Jinping kind of rewriting the rules, kind of elevating himself to the level like Mao Zedong, like Deng Xiaoping, like Jiang Zemin. So we're seeing this transition. We're seeing a collective centralization of power that we've never seen before, not since the Cultural Revolution, and this is quite remarkable and quite a precarious step in China's history, I would say.
And do you agree that yes, there are different factions represented at this party Congress, or is he basically tightened the screws on the whole system?
No, I think for sure there is dissidents. I'm sure there is fractions within the party itself that have different opinions, whether it's to open the country more, to liberalize the economy, as the speakers have. I'm just echoing what the speakers had said, but it's for sure that there are fractions within the party itself. Some wish to be more insular within the country, and others wish to open the country more to external parties, to engage with the global system more. So it depends on, and also as the previous speaker had also said, there are different fractions within the different levels or hierarchy of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government itself. So that's something that's quite interesting to see during this party Congress, is how these different fractions come together under Xi Jinping.
And we certainly don't want any bad news in China. Surprise announcement this Monday. China delaying third quarter growth figures. No new release date, no explanation from the statistics office for this delay. André Lezeux-Petri, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, yes, we're talking about a strong man, but we're talking about a weaker and weaker country. I'm worried for the country that we might see actually the beginning of the end of the Chinese miracle, and accelerated by this change of politics, because basically what we see with Xi Jinping is the end of what made the success of China.
Wasn't that always going to be the case? You can't have 6% growth forever. You need a soft landing at some point.
That's what we heard every year between 1980 and, maybe not 1985 and 2015. And it went on. It went on because there's this immense demographic potential of people going from the countryside to the city. So you did not necessarily have a growing population. You just needed to have a growing middle class. And that fueled, and that could have fueled probably much longer. What we see with Xi Jinping since now a couple of years is, for the first time, ideology far superior than pragmatism. Pragmatism was the ultimate buzzword. I mean, Deng Xiaoping was the symbol of this pragmatism, this famous cat image that has been repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. By the way, it's interesting because Xi Jinping is using this word glorious, but at that time, Deng Xiaoping was saying to be rich is glorious. Now, it's about nationalism, which is to be glorious. So I think he's actually killing the golden egg, and we might see internal dissent, especially from the middle class, which can't anymore stand, for example, the zero COVID policy. I mean, you hear more and more from individuals that they see China as a golden prison where you cannot escape.
All right. For months, many believed that that once this party Congress passed, authorities would start to release the pressure valve on that zero COVID policy. Now, after listening to the leader, they're not quite so sure.
In responding to the sudden outbreak of COVID-19, we've put the people and their lives above all else and tenaciously pursued dynamic zero-COVID policy in launching an all-out people's war to stop the spread of the virus. And we've made tremendous encouraging achievement in both epidemic response and economic and social development.
Anne-Marie Brady, why this zero COVID policy?
Well, they have a very low rate of vaccination in China and for COVID, and the vaccines they have are not effective against the new variants. But it's clearly a political tool to control the population. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see lifting of restrictions after March when the National People's Congress meets. And you mentioned about 6% growth. China had double-digit growth for 2 decades. They need 6% growth at least just to have enough employment. They've got 19% youth unemployment at the moment. And in April, June, they had zero growth or almost negative growth. So this is really unsustainable. And I agree with you. The economic situation is extremely dire in China right now.
And do you agree with André that they could have kept building the middle class?
Well, they have indeed killed the goose that laid the golden egg, because China, was promoting the knowledge economy and had more of a vibrant society. I mean, the quest for it wasn't that people sought a dominant leader. Well, remember, 2012, you had those remarkable political crises of Bo Xilai, the mayor of Chongqing, his wife being accused of poisoning and killing an English guy, and then there was the Zhou Yongkang, who was in charge of state security, accused of plotting with Bo Xilai. So there was this incredible political situation that Xi Jinping sort of inherited, a political crisis situation that the leadership gave him, the old leadership, a little bit more power, and he accumulated more and more power. So he's constructed this narrative about the need for a strong leader. But look what he's done with China since he's made many successes. There have been a series of disasters.
So a series of disasters. That's strong language. Zhaoan Shen, you agree with that?
I don't think it's necessarily true that China's economy would stagnate. I think what we've seen so far is that China has yet to open up to the world in terms of its COVID restrictions. So if you look at other Western countries like the United States or France or the UK, opening up of COVID has accelerated growth. So we're not really sure what's going to be like after COVID restrictions are dropped in China. So I don't think it's fair to say that it's a disaster right now. And I think right now, in terms of COVID restrictions, Chinese people, like many people around the world, are frustrated by the restrictions placed on them. We've also seen pockets of protests in Beijing where people have actually started protesting not just against the COVID restrictions, but against President Xi Jinping himself, which is quite unusual in Beijing. And I think the censorship bureau has went as far as to censor the term Beijing in Weixin and Weibo on social media platforms in China as well. So this is quite an unusual and unusual step by the Chinese government.
Again, we're talking about the zero COVID policy. China's biggest metropolis knows a thing or two about lockdowns. Shanghai experienced an Omicron lockdown from February 28th of this year to August the 7th. At the time, there was anger and blowback over the handling. Today, residents, when they're interviewed, choose their words carefully.
At this stage, we must adhere to the dynamic zero COVID policy. This is the most suitable policy for our country. Since the national level has set the tone, we as ordinary citizens should support and cooperate with the policies of the country. But I also hope that in the process of implementing the policy, it can be more humane and more scientific to minimize interruptions to our daily lives.
More humane, Jean-Louis Roca, we understand, because there were times when it was quite brutal, the way people were cordoned off and told to isolate, and even sometimes they had trouble getting food. But what does he mean by more scientific?
More scientific, I don't know exactly, because I'm not, in the discussion, these people, and on which, kind of research they are relying to say that. But I think that an important element as well, I think, is now a lot of legitimacy now is based in China on the fact that precisely China, to a certain extent, escaped to a real big number of dead people, linked to the COVID. And now it's difficult, to accept, and that would be probably what, the risk, for the future, if precisely they decide to change the zero COVID, to say, okay, now we have to accept dead people, because that for sure, if you shift from zero COVID to living with COVID,
or you heard Anne-Marie Brady, you import vaccine that's more effective.
Exactly, but the problem is that that's also a problem of pride and of legitimacy, because from the beginning, China said, okay, we can solve our own problem about COVID, and we're probably more efficient from the point of view than the other people. What I would like just to add about, the problem of a middle class economy, etc. It's important to remind that since the end of the 90s, in fact, there is a sort of social contract in China that prosperity and pride to be Chinese, again, the fact that maintaining, in fact, the one-party system. And of course, that means an increase in the number of people belonging to the middle class. Now, basically, we have, depending on the definition, we have something like 350 to 700 million of people belonging to that. The problem now is that, first of all, it's very difficult for different reasons to maintain all these people in this class. And secondly, it was planned to allow a certain number of migrant workers to enter the ranks.
When you say migrant workers, explain what you mean by migrant
people
workers.
People coming from the countryside and you went to, the different economic zone and now everywhere in China were, we say, exploited to precisely to provide a sort of Chinese miracle, as we say. And precisely, these people are supposed to enter the ranks of the middle class because we need them for stimulating the domestic demand, because precisely we are supposed to shift from an economy based on investment and export to an economy where the domestic demand would be the driven force of the Chinese economy. And that's the reason why the question of the middle class is so important, because we need this population, not only in terms of economic growth, etc., but also in something that Xi Jinping mentioned in his report, the fact that the modernization of the Chinese population is not finished yet. And then we have to modernize the people, to modernize the lifestyles, etc., really to create this kind of a developed society. We would like to create something like in 2030, 35, or 2049, depending on the document. Then this thing is very central from a political point of view as well, because the middle class is viewed as a moderate group of citizens able to understand the general will, I would say, of the population, and protesting, but at the same time trying to negotiate, to understand, and being educated enough to become real good citizens.
André Nozick-Pietri, your thoughts on this, because you have a leader who's pragmatic, and yet he's scaring away foreign investors if they, particularly with the zero COVID policy.
Well, I don't think the term pragmatic applies to Xi Jinping anymore. I think maybe...
It did at the beginning, did it not?
Maybe, but probably we will never know if it was a plan to become a totally authoritarian system like it was, or it was just an opportunity to use anti-corruption, and anti-corruption was used 2014, 2015 as a way to eliminate its political rival.
He made a very clear speech soon after he came to power about rickets in the party. So he made it clear he was planning to cleanse the ranks. We
yes,
did know
but
that.
we will never know if
Document 9, a few months later.
Probably, but we never know if it was used as an alibi to clean up honestly. I mean, 1 million people have been touched by this anti-corruption policy, the famous tigers and the flies, so the big shots and the anonymous bureaucrats. But what I want to say, no, today we have entered. You asked at the beginning of the discussion whether this system is here to stand. I mean, we have, thanks to digital means, a totalitarian digital society. And today, we need all to realize what is going on in China. Everybody has to use its code and its color code to know if they can travel, if they can go out. And basically, somebody can refuse your buying a train ticket or a travel ticket or a plane ticket, depending on the system. Obviously, it's all based on the COVID situation, but it has been used to completely control the citizen. And I think this one is very dangerous, especially with what Jean-Louis just said. With a middle class, every time in history has never accepted that kind of situation. At one point, there's a point where a growing number of people feel dissent. So I'm particularly worried. And if you think from a Chinese perspective, maybe they went into this, there were a lot of very naive, and there are still a few Western leaders that were ready to leave China, basically ride the wave of globalization massively on their benefits since 2001. And since Xi Jinping is there, the aggressiveness, the fact that he publicized his 2025 policies of becoming a leader in technology and industry, suddenly made the Western world, if I can summarize it like that, wake up 2016, 2017. And it was Trump, the first one who was, very, very sensitive to that. And the Europeans woke up like every time 2 or 3 years later. I think they would have continued this very soft diplomatic voice. I think it could have continued for 10, 15 years. And then China might have been rich and strong enough to really be independent. Today, it's doubtful.
Zhao Wanshen, you had first Donald Trump, very blunt at taking shots at China, and then you had COVID. Are these outside factors the reason for this transformation, this political transformation we're witnessing?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think what happened during the party congress is what we've noticed that President Xi Jinping has promoted kind of the idea of quote unquote national rejuvenization, which also has been kind of seen as a thinly veiled version, a Chinese version of Make America Great Again in some ways. But I think in terms of his foreign policy, it's quite interesting to see because in terms of this national rejuvenization policy, what we've seen is a more aggressive action towards the self-governing island of Taiwan, in which reunification under the People's Republic of China being one of those main objectives is a relative value or a benchmark for President Xi Jinping's a kind of success in some ways.
It sounds almost like it's become central to the foreign policy platform.
Yeah, it has. I mean, just a couple of months ago, we've seen kind of these drills around Taiwan, these 7 military sites that basically blockade Taiwan. So, long are the days where, China is quote unquote hiding your strength and biding your time. The time is essentially now. Chinese diplomats under Xi Jinping has become kind of proud Chinese warriors who are basically firing shots to anyone who dares to question their governments. So we've seen these aggressive Chinese diplomats kind of pushing their government's objectives and their government's interests around the world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Europe. We've seen a more aggressive China on the world stage.
And we're seeing the cheers for the party congress that are sometimes even stratospheric, state media publishing images from the Chinese Space Lab out of the Shenzhou 14 crew members there celebrating the moment. And it's interesting when you listen, Anne-Marie Brady here, something as innocuous in the past like a U.S. aircraft carrier docking in Manila, which was what we saw on Saturday, the USS Reagan. It was regularly scheduled. Now it takes on this whole new significance.
What do you mean about shows of force from the United States?
Well, it's just like the Pacific is this battleground for a standoff.
Well, it's the international, the strategic architecture in the Pacific has been a certain way since about 1950, with the island chain concept, and and that's part of what China wants to change, really. But I go back to something that you said right at the beginning. You said that China was on course to be the world's most powerful nation. Now, I'd really challenge that. What is the measure of power is something that we really consider in political science. And I think the measures of power are changing.
So it's no longer things like GDP?
Well, it's not only that, but I mean, military power. You have to have quite a balance sheet to look at the different measures these days. But China, you look at Russia. China's weak and powerful. Sorry, Russia is both weak and powerful. So, will China be on track to be the world's most powerful nation? That I don't think anyone has said that was going to happen. The economy was growing, but now we see it's not. And I do agree that COVID has delayed natural economic growth, but they need 6% just to be have enough employment for the young people.
Has COVID changed the thinking? Because we saw it in Russia, where some are speculating that Vladimir Putin's inner circle got smaller during COVID. Has the same thing happened in China?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think that already happened in China. Before 2012, when Xi Jinping came into power, for about 15 to 20 years, Chinese intellectuals were really included in the policy-making process. And the party created the middle class. So the middle class, they're great studies, the CCP, of social science. They understood that traditionally the middle classes would rise up against the rulers and seek more rights. So they've created a middle class that was dependent on the party. So everyone's been saying, well, what's going to happen then? We're waiting for the Chinese middle class to rise up. But the party has created a situation that it's very difficult to rise up. Xi Jinping went against every possible force of opposition in society. So what I've been saying for a while is we all need to look after our health and be prepared for China the way it is now, not the way we would like it to be necessarily, for quite a long time. Xi Jinping is our modern-day Stalin.
Jean-Louis Rocca, you agree?
Yes, what is very interesting is about precisely the middle class in China, that we had a lot of research in China and outside China about that. And there is a myth about precisely the fact that middle class is supposed to change, in fact, the society. But historically, it's not really true. It depends. It's very complex. Even in Taiwan, in South Korea, it depends on the time, the period of time. And, it's very complex, really. What we had in China for the time being is a middle class, people who are ready to defend their interest. And we have a lot of social movement about that. For example, you see, all these buildings, all these people living in these buildings have launched a lot of social movement against the developers, construction companies, against the people in charge of the management of et cetera, et cetera. We have a lot of social movement against pollution as well. Recently, we have a lot of problems with the banks, which were where the money disappeared and people were absolutely not happy with that. Then we have a very active middle class. The problem is that this middle class, and probably it's also the case in many, many cases in the world, are not really fond of changing the political system because they don't know by which kind of system they would like to replace the system. They don't know if democracy, nobody is able to say, okay, guys, you have to change your system to get rid of the Communist Party and to adopt a democratic system, because they don't know in that case if their interests will be more protected than in the present situation. Then people are ready now, and to a certain extent it is accepted by the party, to protest when the problem is limited geographically, socially, a problem where the party anyway has to solve, for example, the fact that the real estate branch is a mess, is really messy. And then the party, and that will be for sure something it will have to do very, very, very rapidly, to organize more, the system, to change a lot of things and probably to get rid of a lot of practices which are really very bad for the time being.
Right. So that Zhao Wansen, let me ask you, because there's that question of that's just been raised there by Jean-Louis of known knowns and known unknowns. So it brings us back to Xi Jinping and consolidating that power. Is it good news or bad news when the man who's in charge stays on?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, though. But I would have to say that, under President Xi Jinping, we have seen, 60 million people are lifted from extreme poverty during his 10 years in power, which has added to his public support. If you look at the history of since the 1950s and 1960s, more than 850 million Chinese people have been lifted up extreme poverty. The overall literacy rate went from 20% to more than 95% today. So we've seen extreme transformation in Chinese society. We've seen, people being lifted from essentially third world country status to first world country status. Whether that would be sustainable in the future is a very difficult question to answer. But I would say that under Xi Jinping, whether this new model, whether a one-man rule would be beneficial, that would be very, very difficult to answer, because it depends on his policies. It depends on how the world reacts to his rule, how external factors also impact the economy flowing in and out of China. There are different factors that play into it, such as, the aging population, the changing demographics, how Chinese society is stagnating in terms of the employment rate, as the speakers have said. So it's quite an interesting dynamic to look at.
It's an interesting dynamic. And of course, this COVID effect we've been talking about the last 3 years, and André was with us when we first had the first breakout of the pandemic. You have the effect working both ways. Here in Europe, this wake-up call to the fact that we're so dependent on China for so many vital and strategic industries. Ahead of his visit to the Paris Auto Show, which opened this Monday. The French president noticing, of course, the Chinese electric vehicle makers have a strong presence there. Emmanuel Macron stating his preference for vehicles made in Europe when it comes to electric cars. And this is in the wake of the Biden administration limiting China's access to chip technology from that comes from the U.S. market. That was an announcement made at the start of the month. The stakes are getting higher. China on the radar of EU foreign ministers as they meet in Brussels ahead of an EU summit later this week. The question now, and I'll turn to the Franco-German in the room, will that summit gloss over Olaf Scholz's trip to China, scheduled for November 3rd and 4th? The German chancellor will be flanked by leaders of big business, last week saying decoupling from China would be the wrong path. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think they don't have any choice anymore. You have most of the big German companies, the big automaker, the big chemical companies, have 50% of their revenues in China, 80% of their growth, and probably more than 100% of their profit. So they are completely already stuck and completely dependent. And there is no good exit. It's a little bit like with Russian gas. The question is, do we have in Europe the capacity to do exactly what the US is doing? Because I like my president, but he's saying Europe has been recognizing this problem of dependency, but we still have wide open our doors. And I think there was just a big Munich rental company who just ordered 100,000 electric cars from BYD. So we are currently destroying our industry in Europe willingly without doing anything. The US seemed to have the capacity to react, probably very aggressively towards China. We saw that with semiconductors, but Europe again is.
But isn't there a little bit of a change? We heard the French president announcing with Stellantis there's going to be all these electric vehicles made here.
Yes, but there is no practical decision. I mean, today 55% of batteries are coming from China. 97% of what we call permanent magnets. It's a bit technical, but that's what you need to drive electric vehicles. 97% comes from China. So in 2035, the EU has decided to ban thermal engines, which is a great news for the planet. But basically, we are entering into a Chinese dependency, which is going to be much worse because the Chinese play it much more strategic than Vladimir Putin. And we do that without any reaction. So this is this lack of strategy, which I think is watched very closely in Beijing. And I must say, there has been a lot of debate in my other country, as you mentioned, Germany. What the hell is the chancellor doing 2 weeks after a Congress that is going to nominate a one-man authoritarian leader? Why do you need to give him a blessing by making an official visit to China? This is, from a diplomatic standpoint, is unexplainable.
Unexplainable diplomatically, but Andre's just explained it very well when it comes to Germany's vital dependency on Chinese trade. Your thoughts on this, Anne?
Well, I mean, the EU has some partners who are very close to China, but separate. EU is not the only grouping. So there's a grouping called D10 that is forming around strategic technology, and some European partners are part of that. So there is a decoupling underway. And it's not easy. I don't think we've ever really been in this situation. I mean, the US was buying a lot of and selling a lot of products to Japan in the lead up to Pearl Harbor. But this kind of ways in which we're entangled, our economies are entangled with China is somewhat unique. Talking about electric vehicles, France's territory, New Caledonia, is a source of a lot of the nickel in those batteries. So if our governments wanted to, it could think differently about how we, our technologies, particular technologies, and where we want to source them. But it really takes political will to do so. And that's the challenge, is whether the politicians, certain politicians, enough politicians in Europe, will understand and see the risk in China, see China as it is, rather than they would like it to be. And I see that it's been interesting with change of president in the United States that you're actually getting a stronger policy and a long-term strategy on China when it comes to strategic technology. Whereas with Trump, it was quite variable and seemed to depend on his mood in different months. the US are signalling that they are, facing up to the China challenge. And I think what we're seeing is some actions have changed. Maybe the words are not as strong in some countries. But you have retired politicians like your former president who will go to China. They get invited. They have business opportunities. That's another problem altogether. Elite capture.
Elite capture. Zhao Wanshen, what's the future of decoupling under Xi Jinping's third term?
I think it's quite dangerous in some ways as well for China. I mean, most of the world's advanced semiconductor chips, for instance, are technically not made in China. They're made in Taiwan. They're made in South Korea. So there is also there are consequences for decoupling for China as well. In terms of just the relations between the West and China, I mean, President Biden, for instance, just this month had released a U.S. national security strategy, which actually called for outcompeting China and constraining Russia. So it identified China as one of the only competitors that would be able to reshape the international economic order, and it also kind of listed Beijing as having this kind of ambition to create its own enhanced sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific region and become the world's leading power. So there is an identification by President Biden for this risk. And I think it's quite interesting because the word outcompeting means that it's not necessarily to constrain China, not necessarily to slow down China, but in terms to outcompete China means to create more advanced technology, to produce more American goods, to kind of outcompete China in the sense of technological aspects. So I think right now we're seeing is a technological race between China and the US in the near and long-term future.
Very briefly, because we're out of time, André.
Yeah, just one word on, actually, the US is now sometimes giving a good reason for the Chinese to feel under pressure. The just recent decision on chip makers now forbids US persons to work in any kind of way with their Chinese counterparts. That means suddenly all the US citizens that were with chip makers cannot anymore handle that. If that is not constraining more than outcompeting, I don't know what it is.
One final word, Jean-Louis Rocard.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to remark that the world economy is a market economy at the same time. That the states can decide, adopt new policies, etc., etc. But the business is business, and people are concentrated on the money they can do when they are doing business at the same time. That it's not so easy to change the rules like that. Just one example, you mentioned our president about, electrical cars, but it's important to say that at the same time he said that the salaries, wages are too high in France, and we are lacking of competitivity. Then how can you do at the same time, to build electrical car in France, for example, of battery, and at the same time, not to pay the people for that, or to pay, a very slow wage. Then, it's not really easy to decide like that politically when we are in this kind of world economy.
Yeah, and we have a general strike on Tuesday here in this country. That's a different story. I want to thank you so much, Jean-Louis Rocard. I want to thank as well Anne-Marie Brady, André Lezekug-Petrie. Thanks so much to Zhao Wanshen for being with us from Singapore. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.